The following audio recording has been designed for learning purposes only. Do not share, distribute, or provide any type of copies, or this audio lesson will not be made available to you. Good luck with today's lesson.
Andrew Johnson was a white Southern Democrat. He was the only senator from a state that seceded from the Union during the secession crisis that did not leave his seat in the Senate. And therefore he was held with great esteem during the years of the Civil War as a national hero. Andrew Johnson, though, had many, many, many flaws. He was a horrible racist who did not believe that blacks and whites could live together. He didn't have a formal education at all. He didn't attend school one day in his entire life, so he is greatly lacking in education. He's a Democrat, which really opposed the Republican Party's views on basically slavery, and he's a Southerner. So everything that you don't want in a leadership position at this really tenuous time in our history, just as the Civil War ends, you get. So truth sometimes is stranger than fiction. So this proved to be a huge problem. Initially, Congress is willing to go along with Johnson. Johnson says he's going to follow essentially the 10% plan and do what Lincoln had wanted to do. Everyone's fine with that. He says that he wants Reconstruction to be short, like Lincoln did. Nobody really knew exactly what that meant initially. Johnson puts a date on it. He says by the last day of December will be the last day of Reconstruction, 1865. He also says that the states have to certainly rescind their order of secession and pass the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. So he says basically all Southern citizens will be able to regain their American citizenship with a few exceptions. And so here's something that Lincoln had said. Johnson says that any planters who are worth $20,000 or more or high-ranking ex-Confederate officials had to personally come to Washington, D.C., make an appointment with the President's office, and meet with President Johnson and ask personally for their citizenship back. But for the majority of the population, about 99% of the Southern population, all you simply had to do was take an oath to the Constitution, find a federal official in your county, and do that, and you were fine. Now, so essentially the planters, those the 1% who own 50 or more slaves, the wealthiest people, those who were the most influential in Southern society, who had run society politically, they were the ones that Johnson wasn't willing to let off as easy. But once they came to Washington, which would have been a hardship at that time, the railroads had been torn up. Those that even existed in the South were essentially not functioning. So those were being rebuilt. Most of the South is still rural. They didn't even weren't even close to any railroad lines. So it would have been difficult to get to Washington, D.C. So he wants this to be a bit hard for them to get there to see him. Of course, getting in to see the president is not as difficult as it is today, but nevertheless, it was still a difficult process. You had to wait hours or sometimes maybe even days to be able to get in to see him. But once you saw the president and asked for your citizenship back, he was very much prone to give it to you. And so,
how come he wanted that done, being that he was a Southerner?
That's a great question.
That he was against.
Right. So the question was, why did Johnson want the Southerners to do that, these planters? It's because he came from the poorest class of white people extremely poor. He didn't have an education. He was forced to work from the time he was a young child. And he always felt that those wealthy people in his community looked down upon his family when he was growing up. And so he wanted to, this was a way for him to get back at them personally. So, which isn't very adult of him. But anyway, that's what he did. And of course, everyone's willing to go along with it because there's nothing in the Constitution that says what can or cannot be done. It's all being made up from scratch. No one had ever, the Founding Fathers had never foreseen a situation like this. So Congress is perfectly willing to do whatever he says. Now, Congress starts to have second thoughts as October, November, and certainly December come along, and southern states haven't been doing even the minimal amount of what they're supposed to be doing. You have southern states like South Carolina that refuses to rescind their order of secession, let alone ratify the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which, of course, abolished slavery. Because the Emancipation Proclamation, of course, was an executive order that was used as a war emergency power by the president, only eliminating slavery within the Confederacy, not eliminating slavery in those slave states that hadn't seceded from the Union. So, but anyway, when December 31st came along, that was essentially it. January 1st comes by, and Reconstruction, the president says, is over. The northern senators and congressmen were saying, how can this be? Especially as the South had been doing, some of these things that I was already talking about, including reworking the slave codes into what's known now as the black codes, essentially limiting the rights of those freedmen. The freedmen, of course, the term for the newly freed people who had been held in slavery. So this is the black codes. The black codes are very restrictive about movement of the freedmen, about their ability to support themselves. Essentially, the laws say things like, if you cannot support yourself or your family, you can be arrested, and you can be forced, essentially imprisoned, or the idea was you can be sent to a plantation to work for free, which sounds an awful lot like slavery, right? So, and of course, the northern public, as well as their representatives in Congress, are extremely upset over what's going on in the South. And yet President Johnson says, nope, doesn't matter. Reconstruction is over with. We're all just one big country again, and that's all. But that's not really what's going on. We'll get to that in a moment. In the meantime, the Freedmen's Bureau had been working since the war ended to help the freedmen to adjust to their new life as free citizens. Although that term citizen is really questionable when it comes to the viewpoint of white Southerners, especially that elite class that run society. Nevertheless, the Freedmen's Bureau is charged with helping to resettle freedmen if they have gone, living somewhere other than where they had lived previously on the plantations. But most freedmen just actually stayed where they were, living on the plantation. And the Freedmen's Bureau is charged with helping write work contracts for all the freedmen because technically the government said that not one seed can be planted, whether it be for like food or cotton, until you worked out an agreement of what the job of the freedman family would be and what the job of the planter would be. Of course, the freedmen had no money, so the planter is going to be putting up the land for them to work on, the seed, the tools, often the food as well, and then that would be deducted from the profits when the cotton is sold the following year. The South, by the way, is on the verge of starvation. People in the winter of 1865, there's accounts of people boiling their clothes and eating their clothes. So it's a very precarious time. So I definitely imagine that people are definitely planting their gardens as soon as possible, or planting the food crops right away without any type of contract to go on. Things were so bad at that time. But anyway, in theory, that's what's supposed to go on. The Freedmen's Bureau is also establishing schools to make up for the huge need of about having a population of, so about 10% of the population could read or write of African Americans in the South. But that still meant that there was about 3,600,000 people that couldn't read or write. So they were helping to establish schools. They established about 3,000 schools, which was woefully inaccurate, insufficient. It only was able to serve about 150,000 people. And it didn't mean it was just children. It could mean that it was men and women as well. Everybody that could was interested in trying to get some type of an education. But the Freedmen's Bureau is always lacking in funds. They never are supplied with enough money by Congress and with people to work for them. A lot of young single women actually felt it their moral duty to go to work for the Freedmen's Bureau in the years that it existed between 1865 and 1872, to go into the South and do whatever they could to help make the lives of the freedmen better. But obviously there's not enough teachers. The freedmen had definite ideas about freedom. And certainly their ideas about freedom existed from watching what really a very small percentage of the white population of how they lived, and primarily the wealthiest people. So, you know, if you watch too much reality TV about rich people in Orange County or whatever, or on Long Island going to the beach in the summer, your view of what the world is like is going to be skewed, you know, because most of the world didn't live like that. But anyway, like women not working. The white women on the plantation didn't work. I mean, they oversaw the education of their children, they oversaw the management of the house, but that's the extent of it. You know, they're not scrubbing clothes and doing dishes and things like that. And so the first thing the freedmen say are that, you know, for one thing, we're not going to work like run the plantation like it was. So we're going to farm our own individual plots of land. And while we're doing that, our women aren't going to work. They are not going to be part of the agricultural process, because the white women on the plantation who are free, they never worked out in the fields. That didn't last for very long, because, you know, everyone realized within about a year that if you're going to survive, not only are the men going to have to work, but the women and children are all going to have to work out in the fields to get the crop planted, to get the crop, you know, growing, weeded, whatever needs to be done, and harvested, of course. Freedmen were adamant that they weren't going to work in gangs. The majority of the plantations in the South used the gang system. I think I talked about that last week, where you worked in big groups and you were told what to do, a certain thing that you had to do, or a number of things throughout the day, and they were going to work in individual family units now, just like any other American family, farm family, would work at that time. And then they refused to worship in the churches, in the white churches, because historically, on Sundays, both the master and his family and the slave families all attended the same local church together. And but the freedmen say, no, we're going to have our own separate church and worship away from the white community. By the way, it was actually hard to believe, considering, but white people were offended by this. That they would say things like, after we treated them so well, and now look at what they're doing. They're shunning us and don't even want to go to church with us. It's hard to believe, but it's actually something that people said at the time. So the system that evolved is known as sharecropping. It's a form of tenant farmers where you don't own the land, you're working on someone else's land. This system could have evolved quite differently had Lincoln lived and Johnson not become president. Because in January of 1865, General William Tecumseh Sherman issued what was called Special Field Order Number 15. And there were vast amounts of land that had been abandoned during the Civil War, meaning that the planters had left and hadn't paid their taxes. And the land was confiscated by the government. And Sherman ordered in January of 1865 that this land should be divided up and given out to the freedmen so that they would have 40-acre plots, individual plots, that they could help support themselves, because land historically is a source of wealth. So this would be a way that the freedmen population could then prosper for the future. Unfortunately, because of this one man, crazy man in the White House, that all went away. Johnson rescinds the order after Lincoln is assassinated. And so then there's nothing, of course, that General Sherman could do about that. And so the system of sharecropping meant that the majority of African Americans throughout the South were forced to live on and farm somebody else's land for generations. This is something that went on well into the mid-20th century. Now, it largely was dying out during the Great Depression in the 1920s, even before the Great Depression. But there were still many sharecroppers in the mid-19th century, mid-20th century. I actually had a lady in one of my classes very recently, about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years at the most. And she grew up in the 1950s, and she said that her family was sharecroppers and that they made $1 or sometimes less a day. And so in the mid-20th century. So she said they grew up extremely poor and poverty-stricken. And so, but anyway, this is when this whole system develops in this period of Reconstruction. And basically what happened is that cotton is planted, overplanted. Of course, it's necessary to get the cotton crop in the ground right away. In 1865, the South is short on cash. They're short on hard currency, gold and silver. They need to get the crop in so it can be harvested and be sold on the world market and bring in really needed money. Problem with that was that many of the manufacturers in other countries had turned to other sources during the Civil War. With the blockades of the southern ports, it was impossible to get cotton, for the most part, a lot of cotton out of the South. There were always blockade runners. Some cotton did make its way out. But for the most part, they couldn't, in Europe, get cotton, so they turned to other manufacturers in places like Egypt, actually, became a major source for the cotton. And so you start to see cotton being planted in abundance, too much cotton, really literally up to the doorstep, they often said. You can really see it, how close the cotton field is, right next to the family's cabin. And the price of cotton actually drops, and it doesn't recover to what it had been previously, because you have more competition from other places around the world, and now more being grown here on American plantations. And so that meant that there's just too much. there wasn't enough demand for all the cotton that was available. So if anyone ever took a business class, or if you're taking a business class, anybody going to be a business major in here? No business majors? Okay, maybe. You know, supply and demand is the major thing. You know, that's like a major principle when you study business and economics. If you don't have enough of something, price goes up. But if you have too much of something, price goes down. And that's what happened here. And that would be a huge problem for decades to come, because the South continued to rely on planting cotton, and yet could never make the type of money that had been made back in the mid-19th century with it. You also have a problem with something called the boll weevil, which is kind of like some type of disease or fungus that affects the cotton bolls. And so that was a huge problem as well. Cotton crops would be put in, but then they couldn't be harvested because they got this disease. Here's a little bit about the black churches. The black churches provided certainly spiritual support, but it's psychological support as well for the new freedmen population. They opened schools because since there weren't enough schools that were opened by the Freedmen's Bureau, then they try to make up for that as well. Also, what you'll find is once Congress takes hold of the Reconstruction process, you find there's a mandate that schools be provided for everybody, for all citizens, free public education. Public education didn't exist in the South prior to the Civil War. So the black churches were an important part of the experience of becoming a free person, and also kind of the political aspect of it, organizational aspect of establishing a church, running a church, having to have committees, things like that, was very important about the learning experience of being a free person and making your own decisions, things like that. So the black churches were, and of course have ever since, been a very important part of the black community. Remember, if I go too fast, that you can always go on Canvas, and this is all in Canvas. Go to the modules, okay? Which I definitely recommend that everybody go back and review. That's why I put all these PowerPoints on Canvas, so that you'll have the ability to see it again. So, and if you're not familiar with how that works, you can come and talk to me.
Yeah.
Okay. Southern society is largely being run by Northerners after the war ends. And it can be white Northerners, it can be black Northerners, and they're referred to as carpetbaggers. So it's this derogatory term for these Northerners who came down south or remained in the South when the war ended. It's many men who, when their time of service ends, they see opportunities. They see opportunities to open a business or maybe to go into politics, as of course the governments locally as well as on state level collapsed. But what that meant was that you have Northerners who have a disproportionate amount of power compared to the local indigenous, white Southern population. You also had some African Americans who grew up in places like Chicago or New York or Boston, because there was free black population that lived in the North prior to the Civil War, several hundred thousand, somewhere around 350, 400,000 people. So these were the African Americans that would have been, known what freedom was like, would have had it. Some of them, of course, would have had an education, some better education than others. So they would have, some African Americans did go into the South as well and ran for public office. or state office, local offices. Not a whole lot of former slaves were necessarily involved in government, because I mean, they had enough to deal with. It's a huge transition that people have to take care of themselves, take care of their families. In those months when the war ended and people first become free, a lot of times families are trying to reunite and find each other. And so a lot of people are out on the road searching for family members. That's something that actually the white planter population was really upset about, because during slave times you had to have a pass if you were going to leave the plantation. And now to have a free black population where people can go wherever they want really upset the white population. So that's being kind of written into these new black codes about trying to keep people in what they would say their place, things like that. It's really annoying the Northerners. So anyway, this is a little bit about carpetbaggers. The term carpetbaggers comes from carpet bags, essentially the suitcase of the day. You can see that here he's carrying two bags, one smaller, one larger, but a carpet bag is probably everyone at some point has seen Mary Poppins. And when right? Everyone's seen Mary Poppins at some point in your childhood, I would hope. She has that bag where she's taking out a lamp and all kinds of stuff. That's a carpet bag. It's actually a carpet. And 19th century carpets at this time are basically just like an upholstery weight fabric. They're very thin. And basically all you have to do is take a piece of the carpets, because carpets at that time were not woven in giant giant pieces that might be several feet across. They're only going to be maybe about 2 feet across, and so you take a strip of that carpet, sew up the edges, and put a handle on the top, and that's a carpet bag. And that's what many people used as their suitcases in those days. With the South having reestablished its state governments, and also conducting elections for Congress and the Senate to be set up, those supposedly new congressmen and senators all begin to arrive in early January of 1866 to take their oaths and take their seats in Congress. But who were these people? They were former generals in the Army of the Confederacy. They were former Southern politicians, and Congress refuses to allow these people to sit in the halls of Congress. They say you're unfit, and there's nothing that anybody can do. There's nothing the states can do about it. There's nothing that President Johnson can do about it, because it's the prerogative of Congress itself, the members who are already seated in Congress, to decide if a person is truly fit to serve in that body, legislative body. So that meant, so it means even today, that has happened. It doesn't happen very often. Probably happened about 10 years ago was the last time it happened, but it does happen from time to time. If someone is seen to have acquired their seat being appointed corruptly through some type of bribery scheme, or perhaps had committed some type of crime, then Congress is going to say, no, you're not fit to serve with us. And that's what happened. This enrages President Johnson, and it enrages the southern states, the white Southerners in the southern states. But Congress says no, and we don't think that Reconstruction is over. We think that Reconstruction needs to start again. President Johnson, of course, is unwilling to consider such a thing. Congress begins to pass measures. But the problem was in 1866, they could pass the measures, it would get sent to the president's desk, and then he would veto it, because it wasn't a veto-proof majority. They couldn't get enough people to pass the bill until after the midterm election that took place in November of '66, and then when all the people were the newly elected senators and congressmen from the North get seated in the winter of 1867, that's when they were able to pass a veto-proof majority. And Congress said Reconstruction is going to start again, and the South is going to do things properly this time. We didn't fight a civil war. We didn't have hundreds of thousands of young men killed fighting this war to end slavery, for you people to go back and try to reestablish a society that was nothing better than it had been before. So that's what happens. So Congressional Reconstruction will begin in March of 1867. Congress throws the southern states out of the Union. They tell them that they're going to they're establishing martial law, essentially is what they're doing. They divide the former Confederacy into 5 military districts, with the exception of Tennessee. Tennessee is not thrown out. Tennessee actually had followed and done everything that it was supposed to do, including the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which had been introduced, ratified that. But the rest of the former Confederate states now are told that Reconstruction will begin anew. As you can imagine, President Johnson is furious about this. Congress is furious with the president, and they want to try to limit his powers in any way they can. And so they pass a law called the Tenure of Office Act. And it says that the President of the United States cannot fire any high-ranking government official. So that would have meant that any official that would have been nominated by the president cannot be fired by the president. So any high-ranking official that has to be nominated with Senate approval cannot be fired by the president. Congress says if we've approved that person, then we have to approve the firing of that person. They were very worried that some of these really good people, really smart people that had been put in place by Lincoln were going to be put in by put in offices some cronies of the president. And so that was a huge worry. Some yes men. And they didn't want that. Because Lincoln, when he nominated people, he didn't want yes men. He wanted people who were going to tell him their opinion and not be afraid to tell him their opinion. And so he appointed people from various backgrounds that didn't always agree with him, who didn't even want to see him elected president of the United States, rivals who had tried to become president and get the nomination. And Congress really had respected that, and they were afraid that Johnson was going to start firing people, which then he did. After the law was passed, he fires the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, extremely bright man. And so Stanton, for a short time, Johnson relents. He says, okay, fine, he's not fired, he can come back to do his job. But then in the end, Johnson fires him for good, and Congress is furious. And they say he's violated his oath of office, and therefore we're going to try to get rid of him. We're going to try to throw him out. And so the president was impeached in 1868. Impeachment means that it doesn't mean that when you're impeached you're thrown out. Johnson was impeached. That meant that Congress investigated if they believed there was enough evidence that he had violated his oath of office. But you can't be thrown out unless you're tried by the Senate. And so then a court hearing was held where evidence was presented, and both sides could present their views before the Senate that sat as the jury and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court who sat as the judge. And then it was up to the Senate to vote whether or not they believed that President Johnson should be removed from office. Johnson, in the end, remained in office by one vote. Had one more senator gone the other way, Johnson would have been removed from office. But this impeachment process really tied Johnson's hands. Presidents of the 19th century in general didn't have much power, but of course this was extraordinary times, and so Johnson had assumed great powers in those early years, in those early months of Reconstruction, and influence, of course. But it's said that once he's impeached, that he really has no influence and no power, and he's even referred to sometimes as the dead dog of the White House. So. Johnson has no hope of being reelected, and so he's going to go into retirement. He's going to go back to Tennessee, and what he does is, so he doesn't run for election because he knows it's just not a possibility. Democrats aren't going to nominate him. Certainly the Republicans aren't going to nominate him. And so the election of 1868 is going to be between the great hero of the Civil War, U.S. Grant, who is a Republican, and Horatio Seymour, the governor of New York, who's a Democrat. Seymour tries to divide the nation at a time when the nation's trying to heal from the Civil War. He runs a racist campaign of fear of what the future will look like in a society in which whites and blacks live as free people. This is something that most Northerners don't buy into. I should also point out that most Northerners are not especially enlightened. They think it's perfectly fine to have a free society in which black people and white people are equal as long as it's in the South. But you try to bring up the same topic about northern states doing the same thing they're doing down in Virginia, and they don't think it's such a good idea. So just keep that in mind, okay? So white people aren't that great. The white South tries to keep African Americans from voting in the election of 1868. So they start to terrorize. This is the period when the Ku Klux Klan had come about. And the Klan's going around, not just the Klan, I'll get to, there's a variety of organizations. But anyway, they're going around trying to terrorize the black population, or I should point out some of the white population, because there are some white people who were going along with the Republican Party. And so you're taking your life in your hands if you're white and they find out that you're going to vote for a Republican. It wasn't completely successful. Well, it does stop hundreds of thousands of black people in certain areas of the South from voting because of the fear of being killed, obviously. Many are still able to go to the polls, although you're still taking a risk. It's like, you hear every once in a while in countries in Africa or various places around the world where there's elections that are, might be a first free election in 50 years, and people still go out to vote, even when people are threatening to shoot up the lines and stuff. So that's what they're doing here. They're really taking their life into their hands by going out to vote. Or you might vote and you might go home and they'll come for you later. So And the vote in those days is not a secret ballot, which for the most part in the South, they know if you're black, you're going to vote for the Republicans. You're not going to vote for a Democrat who thinks that slavery should be reinstated. But obviously this is a problem in American society at the time, because no matter what ethnic background you are, not having a free vote means that people can hold that against you. And so that is a problem, which we'll actually talk about further about voting, and hopefully today. And then definitely about the free vote, secret ballot in another class that comes up again. So here's how the election worked itself out. Obviously, U.S. Grant won. Definitely doesn't hurt that his first initials are U.S. as well. But anyway, you do see that the Democrats did take some states in the north. Oregon in the west and New York in the east, and some votes in places like Massachusetts as well. So if you're one of those white Southerners who is siding with the Republican Party in an election, like I said, you're taking your life into your hands, and you're known as a scallywag. You're seen as even being worse than, say, a freedman who's voting for a Republican, because as a white person, they saw you as being a traitor against your own people. That why weren't you going along with the standard line that whites and blacks can't live together, and why are you voting for a Republican? So, but what we often forget, especially if you study this when you're in elementary school or junior high or whatever, is it doesn't get brought up. But there were definitely pockets within the South of white communities that had not gone along with the idea of secession back in 1860 and 61, who had supported Union, and so and then of course everybody of course has various opinions, and there were some white people that would have believed that slavery needed to be abolished down south. That's why you had 10% of the black population that could read and write in 1860, because there were some slaveholders that were trying to prepare their slaves for the time when slavery ended. Because the South was really reluctant about certainly accepting the 13th Amendment, but they didn't have a choice. The South had said, well, slavery might be ending, and therefore freedmen may be free, but they're not really citizens. And so therefore, if they're not citizens, and therefore they can't have the rights of citizens, including having the vote, basically how it went along. So the 14th Amendment is created in order to assure freedmen that they are citizens and that they have a right to vote. That they'll have equal protections under the law. It said that if you're born in this country, you are a citizen of this country, this is the only country in the world, essentially, that says that. If your parents are not citizens of this country, and yet they come to this country and you're born here, you are a citizen of the United States. Any other country you go to, your parents aren't a citizen of that country. You can be born in a foreign country, but you will not be a citizen of that country. So that's an issue that my godson has right now. His parents, he was born in England, so he's actually not a citizen of England. He had to take citizenship of his mother's homeland, which is Romania. So, but Southerners still wouldn't recognize then that African Americans had the right to vote. They continued to resist that. And so then finally what happens is that the 15th Amendment to the Constitution was written that said that, yes, all men all have the right to vote. Didn't matter what ethnic background you're from, all men who are citizens of the country, born in this country, have the right to vote. So, sorry, ladies, you didn't get the right to vote yet. It's not going to be until 1920 that that's going to happen. People thought that women having the right to vote would be the end of the family as we know it. It would tear the family apart, women being sullied by the dirty nastiness of politics. I feel like we're all sometimes sullied by the nastiness of politics. So, 15th Amendment comes about a year later. By 1869, though, most states had ratified both the 13th and the 14th Amendment and had been readmitted to the Union. 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, finally. There's still some holdouts. And so Reconstruction is going to continue on throughout much of the 1870s. With the ruling class of the South trying to do whatever they can to get the carpetbaggers out to reestablish Southern society as close as possible as it had been back in 1860 before the war had started. And these people are known as redeemers. These are people who were often former military, so they were veterans of the Confederate armies. They were often members of various radical organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. These would have been politicians who established shadow governments. So this is an interesting situation that occurred during the years of Reconstruction, is that you can have an officially sanctioned, recognized government within your state government that's recognized by Washington, and then you can have a shadow government that sits in the state, and separate elections that are being held. Those who support the official government and those who support the government that's often run by former Confederates. I read a book in graduate school that was talking about that in South Carolina and how that worked, which made for a great deal of confusion and anxiety and just altogether problems within society. So anyway, these are redeemers. And they really see that they can do anything as long as the ends justify the means. So it didn't matter. That meant that they could go out and murder people, and if they could get the power back, then they were willing to do that. And so, lynchings are common. So anyway, the Southerners, in doing this, will really refuse to give in to Northern pressure, really beyond the minimal amount they needed to just get those federal troops out, to break up those military districts, and regain local control. So it didn't matter. They could pass these laws, ratify these amendments, and tell Washington that they were going to behave in a certain way. But they saw once they could get rid of those officials from Washington, they would go back to do whatever they wanted. Did you guys get chapter 14, the Reconstruction handout? I know online there's a quiz, but I thought last week I gave you 14. You have it? Okay, because I just see that some of you don't have it out in front of you. I just noticed that. It's kind of late for that, but you really should, every class have it.
I wasn't here.
Oh, you want to? I'll make sure you get it before you leave. Yeah, just try to keep in mind, because that's really what I'll make the tests are about, and so it just gives you an idea. Has anybody tried to do the online vocabulary yet? Is it working okay? Okay. Did it let you? It's supposed to let anybody who wants to do it more than once, so you can get all the 10 points. It's just designed for you to practice, is all it's designed to do, and study. So, okay. So just keep that in mind. even if you get a 10 the first time, if you want to go back and just make sure that you know it, you're supposed to be able to do it several times. So there were more than just the Klan. The Klan was one organization. Actually, it was founded by Nathan Bedford Forrest and John B. Gordon, two former Confederate military officers, as a veterans group that became radicalized. But there were other organizations as well. The White Brotherhood, the Knights of the White Camellia, the Knights of the Rising Sun were some others. And they were all essentially the same. They're basically what we would use in modern day terms, terrorist groups that went around terrorizing the black population to not vote, to conform to however the white society wanted them to behave at the time. And also, although they would terrorize the carpetbaggers, so these white officials from the North that they wanted to get rid of. Carpetbaggers and their families were shunned in Southern society. They were ostracized, often from even church, which you would think be the one place that people might welcome you, but they were not. And scallywag population as well. So anyway, that's just what on this slide is everything that I've just been talking about. Then what's going on with the Redeemers is that they're trying to unite all the white people within society. Even though technically, the white wealthy population had never had any interest in seeing helping the poor white population in their southern states. But the problem is during this period that really, certainly poor whites and poor blacks have a lot in common. And but the planter class wants to make sure that the poor whites will go along with whatever the planter class wants to be done. And so they use this race card that we're all white people, we have to stick together. And some of that actually will translate into the way that the history is written of the Civil War and Reconstruction years later, in which they start to talk more and more about states' rights and kind of wash over that idea that it's slavery. Well, yes, of course there's slavery. They used to say, even when I was in graduate school in the 90s, yes, slavery's there, but it's a bigger picture. You got to think about states' rights in southern states wanting to have power within the federal system and not being told what to do, but it is about slavery. The documents of secession talk about slavery, why they were seceding, and so I think it's an interesting point. I don't know if high schools and junior highs make as much of a big deal about states' rights anymore as they once did, but just keep in mind that whole idea of states' rights is really not right. And it's coming out of kind of this whole period. It didn't mean that the federal government was just sitting back and letting anything happen, though. In President Grant's first 4 years in office, he was actually sending in troops to put down the Ku Klux Klan or other radical organizations. You see that in this 2-year period between 1870 and 1872, where police arrested 6,000 Ku Klux Klan members in Texas. Grant suspended the writ of habeas corpus in 1871 in South Carolina, which forced 2,000 Klan's members to flee the state of South Carolina as well, and which allowed for African Americans to be able to vote, by the way, in elections. 1870 would have meant that that was the midterm election, and 1872 would have meant that it was this presidential election. And certainly the black population was very supportive of President Grant. They saw that he's the, obviously Lincoln is held up to the highest esteem. Lincoln's the martyr who's assassinated after he led the nation through the war. But then Grant, of course, is the general who won the war. But the Klan's really only broken temporarily. And then due to politics and due to the economy, President Grant starts to back off. And remember, this is all online again. So, I'm not as worried about being as slow as I used to be, since you guys can all go back and see it again. But Grant was having a lot of problems within his administration. He was getting bad publicity because there were political problems, scandals within his administration. He started to try to adopt a more, what he thought was a conservative approach to Reconstruction, to try to placate Southerners for at least a minimal amount of support from Southerners. So he even supported an amnesty law that would pardon those former Confederate leaders, allowing them to regain their citizenship. So there were a few people that did not regain their citizenship, and they were some of the highest ranking officials within the Confederacy. So he had supported that measure. And then there's an economic crisis that occurs as well, and the economy collapses. And so that was a problem that he had to deal with. And so you see from the highest level in government, the president, to just the unemployed worker, people's views of what's important begin to change by the time you get to 1873 with problems in the economy. Grant, of course, needed to be reelected, which he was, certainly by cracking down on the Klan, allowing the black population of the South, which he definitely needed the votes from, to be reelected. So that all happened. His opponent in this election isn't as radical as Horatio Seymour had been in 1868. Horace Greeley is editor of a New York paper who actually is interested in reconciliation between North and South. But most Northerners in 1872 are still not feeling especially good feelings about the South. They're not thrilled about any type of reconciliation. Many, of course, felt that the South needed to pay for what they had done to the nation and should be punished. Horace Greeley, by the way, dies shortly after the election. So had he won, he would not have been there for the inauguration, which would have created a constitutional crisis. And here's Greeley having some kind of weird 19th century beard thing going on.
He's old.
Yeah, but he's all shaved except for around his neck.
Yeah.
I don't know what that's about. I don't even know what that's called. That kind of beard. And then this is actually a little bit odd, the way this map was drawn, just because they show the Republicans in blue, where we tend to see it in red. But anyway, obviously Grant wins. The Democratic field, by the way, is very much broken up. If you notice here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Democrats running for president and are on the ballot. So, obviously that's not helpful. And I'm going to end here with the Panic of 1873. I mentioned the economy takes a downturn that really has a dramatic effect on Reconstruction. When people are getting laid off, banks are closing, and the nation's attention begins to turn away from Reconstruction to trying to help the economy recover. And so that is one of the reasons for failure of Reconstruction and the eventual end of it, although it's still going to be 4 years before Reconstruction ends. Also, people become tired of Reconstruction. Problems with the South, continual whining of the South. And so, anyway, we're going to have to leave it there. Sorry about starting so late. Let's hope there's no more jackknife semis on 696 this semester. And I'll see you guys Thursday.
Good luck with today's lesson.